If you've heard of Bugbear, you've heard of Wreckfest, and if you've heard of Wreckfest, you've heard of Flatout. This excellent trilogy of hard rock-fueled arcade racers was Bugbear Entertainment's claim to fame in the 2000s, paving the way for Wreckfest in the 2010s and onward. But before striking physics-based gold, they achieved mild acclaim for another driving game. Rally Trophy was released in 2001 and proved itself to be a competent competitor to the increasingly popular ColinmcCrae and V-Rally games. Due to the presence of licensed vehicles, this game is no longer available through conventional means, so if what I'm about to talk about looks interesting, head on over to my abandonware or the Internet Archive for a quick download, and don't forget the patches. My first impressions of Rally Trophy were that of slight surprise in regards to the difficulty. I'll elaborate upon that further, but it actually isn't entirely at the hands of the usual suspect in a driving game. Handling these classic machines is not as much of a handful as I feared. In fact, it's a very pleasant experience. Cars in this game are certainly heavy and do not tolerate a lack of attention paid to the pace notes, but that weight also brings a reasonable amount of stability. Anytime I found myself on the edge of control, I only had my own insistence on playing Rally Trophy as if it were any other Bugbear game to blame for that. Hence the video title, the famous McRae saying, "If in doubt, flat out," does not apply to this game. I think the driving model strikes a very good balance between encouraging you to test the limits of your car, but always keeping the brake pedal on standby. I usually wouldn't feel the need to bring up anything related to the co-driver when reviewing a rally game. I'm not nearly well versed enough in the sport to fairly criticize his implementation. In fact, I will shamelessly admit that I usually keep the co-driver disabled and just follow the visual pace notes. Rally Trophy is a bit of an exception. If you've played Dirt 2 and even some more recent rally games, then you'll know that they occasionally like to give your co-driver just a little bit of character. You know, something small, like commenting on your performance at the end, or reacting to a particularly hard crash. This game was doing that back in 2001. Anytime you're in first place, your co-driver will very enthusiastically remark on that. Or, if you don't do too well at the end of a stage, he will have some sassy quip ready. My favorite is when he calls out any wildlife. Watch out! Honestly, I kinda jumped a little when I first heard it. It's such a contrast to his collected delivery of the pace notes. Apart from the sassy co-driver, Rally Trophy also set itself apart at the time through its car selection. Here, you're going to be driving exclusively cars from the 60s and 70s. This was quite a change, given that this game came out around the turn of the millennium, a time when everything was all about the future. But here you are, happily cruising down in 4th gear in your 1963 Mark I Mini without a care in the world for such things as ABS or traction control. The choice of legacy vehicles also lends a bit more believability to the aforementioned handling model. Again, it's certainly not undrivable, and it can be very rewarding to master, but these cars demand some patience and a heavy hand on the steering wheel. That leads us nicely into the overall game difficulty. If you remember from a few minutes ago, I said that the driving wasn't at fault for Rally Trophy's relatively high difficulty. I'd say that the times you're expected to compete against is the real challenge. This is one of those games that, by default, starts on the highest available difficulty, that being intermediate. Being an individual with a colossal inferiority complex, I stuck with it for a few stages. That's when I realized that if I ever wanted to see past Russia, I'd have to turn the difficulty down to novice, if only so that this video can be more visually diverse. Even on the easier settings, you were still not allowed any mistakes. Anytime I was in the lead, it was only by a very small margin, and if I were to lose speed or, God forbid, misjudge a pace note, I'd be better off restarting half the rally. But you know what? I welcome the challenge. Since cars in Rally Trophy aren't inaccessibly difficult to drive, there existed a very real risk of the experience growing dull after you became accustomed to the quirks of each make and model. But since you're always being pushed to drive as fast and as cleanly as possible, that risk never came to be realized, at least for me. I was consistently engaged in both keeping my car on the road and keeping my name high up on the time board. If Rally Trophy were a more recent game, there would have definitely been a third difficulty option that makes it so that just crossing the finish line guaranteed a victory. There's nothing inherently wrong with making your game more accessible, but there's a part of me that gets a kick out of being given no choice but to face the challenge, even if it's less severe than it could possibly be. All of the above also applies to the, for the time, obligatory arcade mode. You race against 5 other opponents on a small track doing at least 3 laps, and you can even increase the lap count if you want. Unfortunately, there's really no perfect difficulty for this mode. Novice completely trivializes the competition, while Intermediate is far beyond at least my own ability. I honestly don't feel that Rally Trophy's driving style suits this kind of game mode all too well. For as tacked on as it felt in that game, Colin McRae Rally 2.0 definitely had the better arcade mode. In typical low-budget Central European fashion, Rally Trophy is a pretty great looking game for its time, and I would say that it doesn't look too bad today. The car models and reflections are especially good looking. The environments don't look quite as polished as Colin McRae Rally 2.0, but the draw distance never gets in the way, and the added fog feels like a tasteful way to cover it up. Although you're not going to be seeing much of it in this video, you can also use an interior camera, which I would argue is one of the best of its generation. For some reason, it took Codemasters quite some time to catch up in this department, despite clearly being the bigger studio. The occasional animal that you'll see running across the track is also a neat detail, which not too many rally games have. I think Expand Rally Extreme did something similar in 2006. A very specific detail that I like are the water droplets on the windshield. I revisited Colin McRae Rally 2005 a few weeks ago, and using the interior camera in the rain is just impossible. In Rally Trophy, the effect is a lot more subtle and it doesn't sacrifice playability. Still, being an old and not AAA game, there are only 5 locations for you to rally in: Sweden, Switzerland, Kenya, Russia, and Finland. For what it's worth, they each offer unique environmental set pieces and are well detailed. One of my personal favorite touches is how the spectators will look different depending on the region. I would say that the only thing that gives away Rally Trophy's origin as a game would be the sound fidelity. Engines sound about as they should, and I've already talked about the co-driver. However, I'm a bit disappointed with the surface noises, stuff like dirt getting kicked up, water splashes, that sort of thing. I wasn't even sure if there was any sound apart from your engine, but when you brake hard, you do hear a bit of rattling coming from your tires at the very least. For some reason, this is one of the few rally games with background music during races. The soundtrack is fairly limited, but I must admit that I really like the funky energy that the music has. I certainly wasn't expecting this kind of soundtrack from a Bugbear game. If you were looking for a driving game with music that's more in line with what their other games contained, look no further than V-Rally or Expand Rally Extreme. Regardless, the sound work gets the job done, and I never found myself missing gear shifts due to inappropriate exhaust notes. Let me tell you, there's nothing more frustrating than not being able to just listen for the best time to change gear. I can think of a few games that messed this up badly. I had a pretty good time with Rally Trophy. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it knocks the crown off of Dirt or WRC, or even its own contemporaries like V-Rally and McRae, maybe even Richard Burns, but it was fun checking out the game that would eventually lead to one of the best arcade racers ever made, and subsequently one of the best Destruction Derby games ever made. As I stated at the start, you're not going to find this game on Steam or GOG, so check out My Abandonware for an ISO. It actually comes with a crack and a CD key in case Windows 10 disagrees with this game's copy protection, that being Securom. Crank the graphics settings and go rallying, and if in doubt, just let go of the accelerator every now and then. Be sure to subscribe and support the show in the description below.